Glasgow, Scotland's largest city, has quite viscerally been part of a crime underworld that was very much dangerous and vicious. Throughout many years, this city experienced infamous regard for its organized crime, one where fear and violence reigned supreme, and business and politics took a back seat to gang wars and trade in drugs. Among the most feared and brutal figures in Glasgow's gangland was Kevin "Gerbil" Carroll, a name that struck dread into the heart of the city's residents. Carroll was born on August 24, 1980, at Stobhill Hospital in Glasgow, and little did anyone know that this early development would eventually change for the worse in his life. When growing up, he was viciously bullied by two boys called Stephen and Edward Lyons, the names that would later plague him in his future life as a hardened criminal. The Lyons family was one of the oldest within the crime world of Glasgow. The Lyons frequently made a power play against the notorious Daniel family. This power and control struggle would eventually shape Carroll's life and ultimately seal his fate. Carroll's fortunes took a turn for the worse when he became friendly with some of the sons of the notorious crime boss, Jamie Daniel. His friendships with Robert Daniel and Francis "Fraggle" Green sucked him into this world of crime. Through his romance, Carroll became increasingly embroiled in the battle between the Lyons and the Daniel crime families, both of Glasgow's most powerful crime families. By the time he was late teens, Carroll was an old face to the police. They had made several arrests for him on smaller crimes. His malfeasance, however, peaked, and by mid-20s, Carroll had emerged as a strong intimidator for the Daniel crime family. Carroll's notoriety for violence and brutality was earned. His favorite tactics included a method known as alien abduction, whereby victims were abducted when Carroll, disguising himself in police uniforms, took them to desolate locations where they were horrifically tortured. Most of them were left either too intimidated to report the event or suffered from such extreme trauma that they could not recall what happened. Indeed, the mere fact of using this tactic by Carroll, as well as his growing notoriety in the narcotics business, really served to cement his position as one of the underworld's feared figures of the Glasgow crime world. Carroll was also known as the leader who had a habit of actually betraying people even close to him. Carroll would sell cocaine to dealers and then rob them back using the same contraband, making this already hostile landscape of Glasgow gangs even hotter. Carroll once attacked a dealer to whom he had sold 5 kilos of cocaine in its purest form, taking the money and the cocaine from his victim. The feud between the Lyons and Daniel families boiled over in the early 2000s. The conflict reached its peak with the theft of a large cache of cocaine belonging to the Daniel family, which was stored in a house in the Milton area that the Lyons controlled. It became personal for Carroll as an insult that had to be dealt with swiftly, brutally. He orchestrated a string of escalating attacks between the two families, sending waves of violence throughout the city. But the Lyons family was not one to take it and run. Feeling Carroll's violent methods firsthand, they began planning their revenge. The first attempt on Carroll's life came in 2003, right outside his mother's home. For what the assault was, although not clear, Carroll was severely injured and survived. The attempted murder brought out Carroll's paranoia even more. He was more wary, but also a more deadly man. His enemies were determined. So was Carroll, who had all the reasons to kill. The Lyons tried again in 2006. During broad daylight, Carroll and his associate Ross Sherlock were ambushed. A car pulled up beside them and shots were fired, which hit Carroll in the stomach. Again, he survived, demonstrating once more his resilience and earning the reputation of being nearly untouchable. Yet these attempts on his life only made him increasingly paranoid. He began wearing bulletproof vests, surrounding himself with armed associates, and constantly looking over his shoulder. The thirst for revenge, now mixed with Carroll's growing paranoia, made him all the more dangerous. He wasn't on the back foot anymore. He was on a hunt for his enemies, as if to beat into them his message of being untouchable. The violent feud between himself and the Lyons family pushed both of them into increasingly audacious attacks on one another that kept startling the people of Glasgow. As the violence worsened, the Lyons family took revenge on Carroll in a fashion that shocked even the hardened members of Glasgow's Underworld. Carroll and his associates supposedly desecrated the grave of Gary Lyons, an 8-year-old leukemia victim who had died in 1991. Gary was Eddie Lyons Sr.'s son, the matriarch of the Lyons family. This desecration was, in itself, an assertion of their intent in terms of the ongoing gang war, showing that Carroll and the Daniels were willing to do anything in order to win it. This is what broke the camel's back for the Lyons family, and the grave desecration of Gary caused them to crave revenge over taking out Kevin Carroll once and for all. The feud, initially based on control of the city's drug trade, escalated into violently personal, as each attack was fueled by a desire for revenge. Violence filled the streets of the city, and Glasgow streets became a battleground. Shootings, stabbings, and arson attacks are now part of everyday life, thanks to the cycle of retaliation by the Lyons and Daniel families. By the late 2000s, the feud had transformed Glasgow into some kind of war zone. Kevin Carroll, the brutal enforcer of the Daniel family, had survived on a cocktail of violent confrontations, near-death experiences, and endless revenge plots since the Lyons' declaration of war. Paranoid after surviving 2 attempts on his life, he was always on the lookout for another attack. It was despite all this that the hardened gambling habit and power thirst of Carroll made him more vulnerable than ever. Among all the bloodshed that took place during these long months of violence, the most sensational incident was in December 2006, when 2 Daniel family enforcers stormed one of the Lyons family-owned car dealerships. They opened fire and killed 21-year-old Michael Lyons. Several others, including his cousin Stephen, were wounded by the attack. This brazen attack only sparked the feud further, and now the Lyons family was even more determined to take down Kevin Carroll than ever. For 4 years, tensions had been simmering between the 2 families, with each faction indulging in bloodthirsty retribution. Then, on January 13, 2010, the vendetta finally came to its bloody climax. Carroll had set up a secret meeting in the parking lot of an Asda supermarket at Roybroyston in Glasgow. Sitting in the back of a black Audi, Carroll was uncharacteristically relaxed. He was unarmed and also without bodyguards. It was the one time in Carroll's life where he would find himself even remotely at such a vulnerable point, had of course been a situation about which Carroll could not have known yet that anyone would think to attack him. He'd been conditioned, effectively, to steel oneself against attack. At 1:23 p.m., a Volkswagen Golf pulled into the car park, boxing in Carroll's Audi. 2 men leapt out and at once began firing into the car. Carroll's 2 associates, seated in the front, ran off unscathed. Carroll was trapped in the back seat and had no opportunity to get out. He was hit by 5 bullets, one of which fatalistically struck him in the head. The attack lasted just 25 seconds, but by its end, Kevin Carroll was dead. He was 29 years old. The killing of Kevin Gerbil Carroll sent shockwaves throughout the underworld of Glasgow and into the community. It was one of the most brazen gangland hits that the city had ever seen, carried out in broad daylight in the car park of a busy supermarket. There could have been an obvious suspect, the Lyons family, but rumors very soon came filtering through that it was much more complicated than that. Police quickly apprehended Ross Monahan, a known associate of Lyons, but the trial collapsed in 2012 due to lack of evidence. The whole case hung from a single particle of gunshot residue extracted from a jacket, but forensic evidence came in as unreliable, with Monahan being released. That, however, was not the end of it. It later turned out that a policeman, Derek McCloy, a disgraced policeman, had been providing the Lyons family with Carroll's location. McCloy was subsequently discovered to have been convicted of drug offenses and breach of the Official Secrets Act. He was thoroughly immersed in the Lyons crime organization, and his treachery made the case even more complicated. It might sound as if even if the Lyons were a part of it, some in the Glasgow underworld believed that Carroll was killed from within the Daniel family itself. Carroll had certainly made his enemies among his own circle and from outside. His violent tendencies, erratic behavior, and lack of loyalty had been making many enemies, And to top it off, he had threatened Jamie Daniel, the head of the family. Some said maybe the Daniel family thought he was just too hot to handle any longer. In fact, it was this suspicion of an inside job that, coupled with the fact that Carol's associates in the car ran without any resistance, and that Jamie Daniel's brother, Francis, was at the site almost immediately after the hit, had fueled speculations and protests to the alleged murder inside job. Was it possible that Kevin Carroll had been set up by the very people he trusted? Carroll's murder ended his bloody game in Glasgow, but with no peace ensued following the killing. The outright daylight assassination of Carroll was an extremely dreadful reminder that the feud between the Lyons and Daniel families was by no means over. The violent legacy of Carroll did not dissuade the rivalry between two families, which continued in its course because both were locked in a bitter struggle over who would reign supreme in the lucrative drug trade in Glasgow. Kevin Carroll will always be a name for many in Glasgow when remembering him as one of the most violent and dreaded figures in Crime City history. Violence and revenge justified his upward rise to power, but brutality went only with the brutality of his death. A fitting end to a man who'd spent his life terrorizing others.